And now over to you, Jack, to introduce Steve.
Okay, and just as a little introduction about my particular interest, and I heard Steve previously at a talk at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I was on a diesel electric submarine, the USS Harder, and in 1968 we were spent the spring in the Arctic and were on our way back to our home port, which was Charleston, in May of 1968, when we were redirected to search for the USS Harder, which at that, or the USS Scorpion, which at that time was missing and or lost. And so when Steve offered his wonderful talk about the loss of the Scorpion, I really appreciated it. Steve graduated from the U.S. Naval Military Academy in 1970 and was accepted into the U.S. Naval nuclear power program. His submarine experience includes being the new construction engineer for the USS New York City, the executive officer on the USS Skate, which was, I believe, the first submarine to surface at the North Pole. And he became the commanding officer of the USS Permit, which became the lead ship in its class after the loss of the USS Thresher. And I think that was around 1963. Steve served as the submarine operations officer in the Gulf War attack on Mosul, Iraq, and then was assigned to the foreign military sales oversight in Cairo, Egypt, and where he retired from the Navy in 1995 and then stayed on, I think, working as a civilian until he ultimately retired. And we've recently welcomed him to Sarasota. Steve, would you tell us your fascinating story about the loss of the Scorpion? It has engendered lots of speculation through the years. And of all the stories I've heard, yours seem to ring true the best.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I'm going to share screen now. In this presentation, we're going to review the timeline of events that led up to the curious loss of the USS Scorpion. We will discuss the possible reasons for this loss and look at the facts that support the various reasons. I am not a conspiracy theorist. None of the information that I'm using is classified. It has all been released to the public. I'm going to start with a little background information. During World War II, the U.S. Navy built several diesel-powered submarines. These were used to locate and sink enemy surface ships and merchant ships. The boats were about 312 feet long, and they could only submerge to a depth of about 300 feet. This is about as deep as the height of the Statue of Liberty. Their hull design was like the surface ships of the day, so they could go 21 knots, about 24 miles per hour on the surface, but only 9 knots or 10 miles an hour submerged. They had a crew of 72 enlisted and 9 officers. U.S. Navy began its nuclear submarine program with the USS Nautilus, commissioned on 30 September 1954. This was basically a World War II diesel-powered submarine with a nuclear reactor replacing the storage batteries on the diesel boats. Being nuclear powered meant that it would not have to surface as a diesel boat to ventilate and recharge their batteries. Had the same hull shape and design as the diesel boat, it was about 320 feet long, but it could dive to 700 feet. They could travel 22 knots on the surface and 23 knots submerged. She had a crew of 92 enlisted and 13 officers. The U.S. Navy went through several attack submarine design modifications over the next 5 years. This picture shows a World War II submarine at the top, the USS Nautilus in the middle, and it shows a U.S. ballistic missile submarine at the bottom. They are not to scale. The World War II sub is 311 feet long, the Nautilus 320, and the George Washington was 381. These design modifications eventually resulted in the USS Skipjack, commissioned in 15 April 1959. The Skipjack changed the hull shape to a teardrop, making the ship much more efficient in moving underwater. These boats were designed to track and sink surface ships, but also to act as surveillance ships, tracking enemy ships and submarines and gathering critical tactical data. These ships could travel 15 knots on the surface, but 33 knots while submerged. They had a crew of 96 enlisted and 16 officers, and they could submerge to 700 feet. That's 2 football fields. On July 29, 1958, the U.S. Navy began construction of a ballistic missile nuclear submarine. These were Cold War deterrents. They were very different in purpose and function. The USS George Washington had a 130-foot missile compartment carrying 16 nuclear ballistic missiles inserted between the ship's control area and the nuclear reactor compartment. She was commissioned on 30 December 1959. They had a crew of 130 enlisted and 15 officers. She could travel 25 knots while submerged. During the upswing of the Cold War, ballistic missile submarines were used as a deterrent to nuclear war because of their 16 nuclear warhead ballistic missiles. They were submerged for long periods of time and not easy to detect. U.S. attack submarines were key in detecting movements of Russian ships and their attempts to spy on the U.S. On 3rd of August, 1961, the USS Thresher was commissioned. Thresher was the lead boat of her class of nuclear-powered attack submarines. This class was unique. They were designed to go much deeper than any submarine to date. She could travel at 33 knots submerged, and she could submerge to 1,300 feet, nearly twice that of previous versions. She had a crew of 96 enlisted and 16 officers. As was mentioned earlier, on 10 April 1963, the Thresher sank during a deep diving test about 220 miles east of Boston, Massachusetts, killing all 129 crew and shipyard personnel on board. It was the first loss of a U.S. Navy nuclear submarine. Documents showed that the loss was due to design and construction flaws. Basically, a surface ship and previous submarines used seawater brought into the ship and piped throughout it to cool components such as motors, generators, and even turbine gears. The Thresher was designed to go much deeper than any previous ship, and this resulted in a much higher pressure in this piping, with the resultant flooding causing the loss of the ship. The normal processes used to bring the submarine to the surface also failed, resulting in the boat sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Her loss was a watershed for the U.S. Navy, leading to the implementation of a rigorous submarine safety program known as SubSafe. This program redesigned the cooling methods inside the submarine, using external water only in one location and a heat exchanger to pipe the cooled, low-pressure fresh water throughout the rest of the ship. SubSafe also redesigned and strengthened the hull and piping fittings and redesigned the surfacing equipment process. It also instituted significant safety checks and design reviews. The U.S. Navy then directed that all commissioned submarines should undergo an extensive overhaul to incorporate the SubSafe design modifications. This process changed the time of a periodic submarine overhaul from 9 months in length in the shipyard to 36 months. Needless to say, this extended time in the shipyard meant the ships that were operationally available were assigned much longer operating schedules as the other submarines were cycled to complete this detailed work. It was during this time that the USS Scorpion, a skipjack class, was in the Mediterranean completing her assigned mission of following Soviet submarines. She was scheduled to proceed straight back to Norfolk, Virginia, but on 17 May 1968, She was directed more than 1,000 miles southwest down toward the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. A group of Soviet naval warships were operating in the area. The operation involved several ships and helicopters, but the observed exercise was unlike anything ever seen before, and the operations did not make sense to the U.S. Navy officials. They wanted to have it checked out. Scorpion was scheduled to check in with headquarters every 24 hours. On 22 May, she missed the check-in. Again the next day on 23 May. Mike Hannon, a second-class radioman assigned to submarine headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, coming back to work that morning, said he was surprised when he entered the communications center. Instead of the normal half-dozen radiomen quietly at work, a large group of senior officers, including several admirals and a Marine Corps general, had taken over the workspace and were talking among themselves in hushed voices. Hannon had never seen any of them before. Within minutes of his arrival that morning, Hannon overheard conversations among the high-ranking strangers that made it clear that the Scorpion had disappeared, and that his crew of 99 officers and enlisted men were considered dead. Scorpion was scheduled to arrive in Norfolk on 27 May, 4 days later. There were messages sent up the chain of command to Navy officials seeking guidance on how to handle the situation. Then on Friday, 24 May, ComSubLant officials who suspected the Scorpion was already lost with all hands announced that it would be arriving in Norfolk at 1 p.m. the following Monday on schedule. And worse, they said nothing 3 days later to dissuade 7 dozen family members from standing vigil for hours on the pier in a raging nor'easter. Obviously, the ship did not arrive. By Tuesday morning, May 28th, the story of a missing submarine led the front pages of newspapers all over the country. The previous evening, in an impromptu news conference at the Pentagon, Chief of Naval Operation Admiral Thomas H. Moore had offered a slender reed of hope to the families of the crew. He said, "The weather is very, very bad out there," he told reporters, "but the weather may abate and the ship may well have been held back by the storm and she could proceed into port." However, Admiral Moore already knew that the Scorpion had in fact sunk with her entire 99-person crew 5 days earlier, on May 22nd. For the next week, dozens of Atlantic Fleet ships and patrol aircraft scoured the open ocean. After several days, a search effort shrank to 5 destroyers, 5 submarines, as was mentioned earlier, and a fleet oiler proceeding in 2 groups down the Scorpion's track from its last known location southwest of the Azores toward Norfolk. The 2 groups, positioned 12 hours apart for maximum surveillance, steamed in a line abreast measuring 48 miles wide as their lookouts peered intently through binoculars and their radar operators stared at their scopes for any sign of the missing submarine. They found nothing. So what was the reason for this high-level deception? The Scorpion had not been in contact since it was initially sent to surveil the Soviet ships. This is where our story begins. The loss of the Scorpion was initially attributed to not having completed her subsafe upgrades. She had been in the Mediterranean Sea and went to the Atlantic near the Azores when she was lost. She had not been on any deep diving missions. The U.S. Navy then changed their story and said she had been sunk by a hot-run torpedo. This occurs when a torpedo becomes activated while still in the ship's torpedo tube, and it can ignite and blow up in place. The ship was located by the U.S. Navy on the bottom of the ocean floor on 30 October 1968. You're seeing the location on the chart. The pictures were taken and that supported no internal torpedo was to blame. You can see that the bow is completely intact. There is some damage from hitting the bottom, but no evidence of an internal explosion. The bow would have been blown open, but that's where the torpedo tubes are. There was no outward explosion, nor was there any indication of a complete failure due to subsafe due to subsafe program identified flaws. The only damage was a break inward near the middle of the ship, which could be indicative of an external torpedo. But why would any external source send a torpedo to sink the Scorpion? Why all the apparent collusion among the top officers of the subland? All went silent and there was no answer for 40 years. On April 2008, a book was published, All Hands Down, the true story of the Soviet attack on the USS Scorpion. It was co-authored by Kenneth Sewell and Jerome Priestler. Kenneth Sewell was a nuclear engineer and a U.S. Navy veteran who spent 5 years aboard the USS Parche, a fast attack submarine. USS Parche had conducted a number of special operations missions. Jerome Priestler is a published co-author of some 40 books, including the New York Times bestsellers by Tom Clancy. These two co-authors shared a significant amount of submarine warfare experience. Based on All Hands Down, a possible explanation of the loss of the Scorpion becomes very interesting. We will discuss the explanation in historical order. We will start with the North Korean capture of the USS Pueblo. US Pueblo AGER-2 was a Banner-class environmental research ship attached to the Navy intelligence as a spy ship. On January 23, 1968, she was engaged in a routine surveillance of the North Korean coast when it was intercepted by a North Korean patrol boat. According to US reports, the Pueblo was in international waters almost 16 miles from shore. But the North Koreans turned their guns on the lightly armed vessel and demanded its surrender. The Americans attempted to escape and the North Koreans opened fire, wounding the commander and 2 others. With the capture inevitable, the Americans stalled for time, destroying the classified information aboard while taking further fire. Several more crew members were wounded. Finally, the Pueblo was boarded and taken to Wonsan. There, the 83-man crew was bound and blindfolded and transported to Pyongyang, where they were charged with spying within North Korea's 12-mile territorial limit and imprisoned. It was the biggest crisis in 2 years of increased tension and minor skirmishes between the United States and North Korea. The United States maintained the vessel was in international waters at the time of the incident, and that any purported evidence supplied by North Korea to support its statements was fabricated. On 23 December 1968, exactly 11 months after Pueblo's capture, the U.S. and North Korean negotiators reached a settlement to resolve the crisis. Under the settlement's terms, the United States admitted the ship's intrusion into North Korean territory, apologized for the action, and pledged to cease any further action. That day, the surviving 82 crewmen walked one by one across the bridge of no return at Panmunjom to freedom in South Korea. They were hailed as heroes and returned home to the United States in time for Christmas. USS Pueblo is still held by North Korea today. It officially remains a commissioned vessel of the United States Navy. In fact, as you can see in this picture, today it's used as a tour location for North Koreans. Key to our story is the fact that the Pueblo had on board several units of the most current cryptographic communications equipment. The crew tried to destroy them, but at least one of the KW-7 Orestes cryptograph machines was taken intact by the North Koreans. It was a serious loss for the US Navy and put all communications at risk. It was suspected that it was immediately passed to the Soviet Union by the North Koreans. Fortunately, the device required a current and updated crypto key. So all the US Navy had to do was change the key and the device would be useless to the Soviet Union. This change was immediately made and the key was then updated periodically. But another key event had occurred in Norfolk, Virginia Naval Base. Late in 1967, before the KW-7 was given to the Soviet Union by North Korea, a United States Chief Navy Warrant Officer and communications specialist who was a member of the Commander Submarine Force Atlantic, began spying for the Soviet Union. His name was John Anthony Walker. This event is the real key to our story. In late 1955, Walker joined the U.S. Navy as a radioman. He served aboard a destroyer escort, then an aircraft carrier. Then he qualified for submarines and served on board several submarines. He was moved up in rank and became a chief warrant officer. He became qualified to handle high-level cryptographic equipment in 1963. He purchased some properties on the side and opened a bar in order to gain some extra income to cover the expenses for his wife and 4 children. Unfortunately, these efforts left him strapped for cash. During his off-duty periods, he drove a cab and shuttled rental cars between cities, but it was still not enough. In October 1967, Chief Warrant Officer Walker had been assigned as a watch officer at the Atlantic Fleet Submarine Force headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia. In this new role, he learned more and more about the activities of the US military and the Soviet military. He would later say he began to realize the Soviets were not the aggressive adversary the Americans feared. Even, and this is a quote, "The farce of the Cold War and the absurd war machine it spawned," he commented, "was an ever-growing, pathetic joke to me." He decided to correct the military imbalance and balance his checkbook by leaking top-secret information to Moscow. He photocopied a top-secret document, drove to Washington, D.C., walked into the Soviet embassy, and asked to see security personnel. The embassy personnel at first suspected it was a trap, but when they saw that the information concerned submarines and was similar to some they had received from other sources, Walker's information was accepted as genuine. He worked with the embassy and they established dead drop locations. He would go to a dead drop, pick up the money and instructions, and drop off information. He was a spy from 1967 until 1985 when he was caught. According to the New York Times, during his 18 years as a Soviet spy, Walker helped the Soviets decipher more than 1 million encrypted naval messages, organizing a spy operation that is sometimes described as the most damaging Soviet spy ring in U.S. history. Walker provided a huge array of secret Navy and U.S. documents to America's Cold War adversary. These included operational orders, war plans, technical manuals, and intelligence digests. At Norfolk, he used his status as an armed forces courier to smuggle documents from headquarters to his bachelor officer quarters room, where he photographed them. There was such a stream of papers he had to be selective. Walker estimated that photographing just 20 of the hundreds of messages that crossed his desk during a watch would have required more than 100 rolls of film over 6 months. Yet everything he left at the dead drop needed to fit inside a single soda can. Walker's wife became suspicious of their newfound financial wealth. One day, she discovered a bag full of classified material in their home. He then became abusive to her, and she decided not to say anything. They were later divorced, and her drinking increased. Finally, in 1984, after 18 years of undetected espionage, Walker's program fell apart. His wife was drinking and decided to call the Boston FBI. The agent became immediately aware that she had been drinking and asked why she just now was coming forward. He began to suspect she was just angry and was trying to get even with her husband. He filed a report, but he did not follow up. A month later, another agent happened to see the report and decided it should be sent to the Norfolk FBI office for their files. 4 months later, a full investigation was opened by the Norfolk FBI office. Finally, on May 20th, 1985, Walker was arrested for espionage. So how does this fit into our story? In late 1967, Walker told the Soviet Union they needed to get one of the new U.S. crypto devices, the KW-7. Thanks to the USS Pueblo, they now had one, and Walker was providing the Soviet Union all of the updated crypto keys for their KW-7. This link is the key which connects all of the following events together. Every encrypted message sent by any US Navy ship or command could immediately be read by the Soviet Union. And the Navy had no knowledge of this breach for 18 years. On 28 February 1968, a Soviet diesel submarine, the K-129, was tasked to commence a Pacific patrol with an expected completion date of 5 May 1968. Upon departure from the Kamchatka base on 24 February, she reached deep water, conducted its test dive, returned to the surface to report by radio that all was well, and proceeded on patrol. No further communication was received from K-129, despite the normal radio check-ins expected when the submarine crossed the 180th meridian and when it arrived at its patrol area about 700 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Although communications were lost when the K-129 was in the Bering Sea, she eventually sank to the bottom about 1,560 miles northwest of Oahu, Hawaii. By mid-March, Soviet naval authorities at Kamchatka were concerned that the K-129 had missed consecutive radio check-ins. First, K-129 was instructed by normal fleet broadcast to break radio silence and contact headquarters. Later, and more urgent communications went unanswered. By the third week of March, Soviet naval headquarters declared K-129 was missing and organized a massive air, surface, and subsurface search and rescue efforts to the North Pacific from Kamchatka and Vladivostok. This highly unusual Soviet surge deployment into the Pacific was correctly analyzed by US intelligence as probably in reaction to a submarine loss. The US Navy also had a system of underwater sensor cables called SOSUS. This sound surveillance system developed by the United States Navy to track Soviet submarines. The cables were located on the bottom of the ocean and were used to keep track of submarines as they approached the US coast. The US SOSUS naval facilities in the North Pacific were alerted and requested to review recent acoustic records and identify any possible associated signal. Several SOSUS arrays recorded a possibly related event on 8 March 1968. Upon examination, they produced sufficient triangulation by lines of bearing to provide the US Navy with the location of the probable wreck. One source characterized the acoustic signal as an isolated single sound of an explosion or implosion, a good-sized bang. Soviet search efforts lacking the equivalent US SOSUS system proved unable to locate K-129, and eventually Soviet naval activity in the North Pacific returned to normal. K-129 was subsequently declared lost with all hands. What is the significance of the K-129? The K-129 was a Soviet diesel-powered submarine, but it carried 3 of the Soviets' most modern nuclear ballistic missiles with a range of 750 miles. These were to be fired at the United States in event of a war. She also carried 2 nuclear warhead torpedoes, also of the most recent Soviet design. The SOSUS system, plus the use of a submarine with remotely operated underwater sonar scanner, found the K-129 on 20 August 1968. This is a composite picture using various pictures taken to show the K-129 on the bottom. So on to the next event. The USS Swordfish, a member of the Skipjack class, entered port at Yokosuka, Japan on 17 March 1968. She required emergency repairs to her bent periscope and damage to the forward part of her sail, which was publicly and officially blamed on an iceberg in the Sea of Japan. She had actually been on a mission to track the Soviet submarines as they departed the Soviet base and the Kamchatka Peninsula. Of interest, the Navigation Center of the United States Coast Guard clearly states there are no icebergs in the Sea of Japan. Also, remember that regardless of what was being said to the public, the Soviet Union was reading all of her encrypted communications thanks to John Anthony Walker. The Soviet base is indicated in yellow. Yokosuka, Japan is indicated in red. So it should be of no surprise that it was covertly suggested by the Soviets that K-129 was lost after a collision with the Swordfish. It is very reasonable that the Swordfish would have been submerged behind or beneath the K-129, providing its position to other U.S. Navy ships or commands. So its location would always be known by the U.S. Navy in the event of a war. So what happened? Well, the Swordfish could have gotten too close. The K-129 could have submerged without warning. There are many possibilities, but the undeniable outcome was that the periscope and forward part of the sail of the Swordfish was damaged, requiring it to return to Japan for repair. And the steering and power system of the K-129 was damaged so that she could not surface and communicate with her home base. It was probably taking on water and could not steer back to port. Instead, it proceeded 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii, where it sank in 16,560 feet of water, 3.03 miles deep, with all 83 personnel. The official the official Soviet Navy publicly released hypothesis is that the K-129, while operating in snorkel mode, slipped below its operating depth. Such an event, combined with a mechanical failure or improper crew reaction, can cause flooding sufficient to sink the boat. But remember, the Soviet Union was aware of every classified communication the Navy sent. You see in this diagram, it's showing the radius from Pearl Harbor. But if you look at where Petropavlovsk is, where the base was that she came from, she was actually closer to the base than she was to Pearl Harbor. So she was en route, but hadn't made the halfway point yet. In fact, she hadn't communicated, hadn't passed that meridian either. This slide shows the timeline of events discussed so far. The timeline is key to explaining the sequence. You see that Walker became the spy in October of '67, Pueblo in January, the K-129 and Swordfish events are in March, the Scorpion is lost in May, and the K-129 recovery begins in August. So you can see how this timeline seems to fit our discussion. So what does the US Navy do when they've located on the ocean bottom a Soviet submarine with the most modern Soviet nuclear ballistic missiles and nuclear torpedoes on board? Of course, they contact the CIA. Interestingly, the Soviet Union's crypto device could not break the CIA code, only what was transmitted on a US Navy system. This allowed the CIA to get ahead of the Soviets regarding the recovery of the vessel. I will now step out of the timeline to present one of the most amazing engineering tasks ever undertaken by the United States. The CIA made contact with Howard Hughes to use one of his subcontractors to design a ship that could go out into the open ocean, 1,600 miles northwest of Oahu, have a control platform that would remain perfectly flat no matter the external condition. It would be able to open the bottom of the ship so that all operations were kept from prying eyes, lower a lifting device 3.03 miles to the bottom of the ocean, grab the K-129 along with its missiles and torpedoes, and lift it back 3.03 miles into the hold of the ship, then close the bottom without being caught. Sounds impossible, right? Enter Project Azorian. If you research this operation, you may find references to Project Jennifer. Jennifer was the CIA's cover project name for all underwater operation. It was leaked to the Soviet Union by John Walker and then leaked to the press. It was incorrectly used as the operation to recover the K-129. The actual K-129 operation was Azorian, which is a subdivision of Jennifer. In early August 1974, despite incredible political, military, and intelligence risks, and after 6 years of secret preparations, the CIA attempted to salvage the sunken Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129. Project Azorian was the most ambitious ocean engineering endeavor ever attempted by man. It can be compared to the 1969 moon landing in its level of technological achievement. U.S. intelligence agencies were able to determine the precise location and develop a means of raising the submarine from a depth of 17,000 feet. Previously, the deepest attempt to salvage a submarine had been accomplished at 245 feet. It was partially declassified, and in 2012, PBS prepared this detailed video. It is on Amazon Prime. You can watch it there, or you can buy it from Amazon for $17. The CIA needed a cover story, as the government could not carry out such a project in secrecy. Fortunately, they had access to a multi-billionaire who's very secretive in the nature of his work. The recovery ship was built as the Hughes Glomar Explorer in 1971 and 1972 by the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Pennsylvania for more than $350 million, about $1.6 billion today. At the direction of Howard Hughes for use by his company, Global Marine Development, it began operation on 20 June 1974. It had a 50,500-ton displacement. It was 619 feet long and 116 feet across. Compare this to the Titanic. It is 70 feet as long, but 110% as heavy. No one at Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock had any knowledge that the ship was anything other than a bottom mining vessel. It was too large to fit into the Panama Canal and had to go around South America to get to the Pacific. In order to carry out its mission of grasping and raising a 2,000-ton object in 17,000 feet of water in the Central Pacific Ocean, it had to have the following attributes: a large center well opening in the hull and a means of sealing it off so the recovered object could be examined in dry conditions, a hydraulic lift system capable of hoisting a very, very large heavy load, a tapered heavy lift pipe string, including tool joints, designed, constructed, and proof tested to exceptionally demanding standards. At a depth of 17,000 feet, this string itself would have weighed 4,000 tons, but it would have to lift an additional 4,250 tons. We'll go into this in detail. They had to develop a claw with mechanically articulated fingers, which used surface-supplied seawater as hydraulic fluid. This claw would be lowered and raised into the hull using two movable lifting towers, which are visible in this picture on each side of the central mast. Had to have a motion-compensated 755-ton gimbaled 40 by 40 foot work platform system that effectively isolated the suspended load from the roll, pitch, and heave motions of the ship. The four gimbal bearings could each support 5,000 tons. This is actually the gimbal section here being lowered on when the ship was being put together. This was necessary because the hull opened down to allow recovery devices to be lowered and the submarine to be raised without any outside ship being able to see what was happening. The 17,000-foot lifting string was composed of 570 rods, each 30 feet long. The pipe string outer diameter was averaged about 14 inches. Once the bottom was open, these would be attached to the grappling system, lowered 30 feet, then the next would be attached, and so on for the required 17,000 feet. This is a display after the fact showing how it was put together. In order to carry out the mission, its massive claw-like apparatus was built by Lockheed to fit to the sub's exact specifications. It was affectionately called Clementine, and it weighed 2,170 tons. It consisted of two steel beams that were 179 feet long and 31 feet wide. The lifting devices on each end of the apparatus were designed to attach to this device and lift it into the well. You can see they've just released it here in this picture. They're opening out and would be raised back up. The lifting device is the item in the center. It would lift in, and well, it could be lowered out of the ship's hull as well as brought back. Hughes told the media that the ship's purpose was to extract manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The marine geology cover story became surprisingly influential, causing many others to examine the idea. In spite of the Soviet Union's request for information, the US government officially refused to comment on the Glomar Explorer. This slide shows the official release copy taken from the Gerald R. Ford Library. It says the United States has issued no official comment on the matters related to the vessel Glomar Explorer. It's the policy of this government not to confirm, deny, or otherwise comment on alleged intelligence activities. This is a practice followed by all governments, including the USSR. Regardless of press speculation, there will be no official position on this matter. Interestingly, this was the first official use of the term refused to confirm, deny, or otherwise comment. Project Azorian was one of the most complex, expensive, and secretive intelligence operations of the Cold War. The total operation cost about $800 million, the equivalent of $4 billion today. Interesting, the operation is very similar to the standard child's claw lifting game. The Glomar Explorer finally reached its destination on July 4th, 1974. But inclement weather delayed the salvage operation for several days. Around the same time as the recovery cage was being lowered into the ocean, the Soviet warship Chesama arrived at the scene carrying a K-MOV Ka-25 helicopter. A Soviet naval tug arrived as well to help in monitoring the ship's operations. The Glomar team had to carry on its operation with the Soviet Navy watching. To prevent the Soviet helicopter from landing on board, boxes were stacked on the helo deck. But what caused the most anxiety during the operation was that debris might float to the surface once the sub was lifted off the floor. Although the Soviets felt this might actually be an attempt to recover the K-129, after reviewing the location, and they determined that the recovery from the open ocean at a depth of 16,560 feet was simply impossible, so they called off their surveillance. On August 9th, the same day that President Richard Nixon resigned, the CIA and the Glomar team lifted the remains of the sub into the ship's gigantic lower hull space. The pipe string was actually lifting 7,127 tons from the 16,500 feet. As the CIA inspected the wreckage, several important documents and manuals were recovered, but the most pressing issue was the discovery of several bodies, 9 of the 98 crewmen who died. While 3 of the crew members were identified, the rest were not. By September, all of the bodies which had been recovered were buried at sea with full honors. A film was taken showing each of the men wrapped in a Soviet flag and laid into a shelved container. Then the container was sealed and lowered into the ocean while the Soviet national anthem was played in the background. This film was eventually provided to the Soviet Union. Interestingly, between the inner and outer hull of the recovered wreckage, they actually found manganese nodules. The actual missile and torpedo material recovered has not been declassified. Although it is not officially reported how much of the K-129 was actually recovered, we do know that parts of some of the grabber fingers broke off. But it really did not matter because the Soviet Union had to assume that the CIA now had a version of its most recent ballistic missile and nuclear torpedo to study. That meant they had to spend the funds and time to completely redesign their program. So now we're in a position where the Soviet Union thinks the US has sunk one of its submarines, along with its 83 crewmen, plus the US then raised the submarine and did not return the discovered bodies, but instead used the event to study Soviet missile and torpedo development. Now we return to the final step of the timeline. The USS Scorpion was in the Mediterranean, following Soviet submarines, when a strange sea event began near the Azores. There were several Soviet ships with helicopters in some sort of exercise, but the location and type of activity was unusual. So on May 20th, 1968, the Scorpion was sent to monitor the activity and report what it found. Remember, the Soviets were reading every status report sent by the Scorpion. One of the reporting activities was a torpedo carrying helicopters. Then communications were lost. Remember, the Soviet U.S. Navy said the Scorpion had been sunk by a hot run torpedo activated while still in the tube, but the pictures taken do not support that. There was no outward explosion, nor any indication of a complete failure due to subsea. The only damage was a break inward near the middle of the ship, indicative of an external torpedo. While researching this precedent, I found an additional item. It concerns retired U.S. Navy Captain Peter Huchthausen. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1962. He retired in 1990. After his military career, he wrote several books, including the K-129, The Widowmaker, which was made into a movie. Captain Huchthausen was the former naval attaché in Moscow. He related in an article for the Maritime Network publication that he had a brief conversation in 1987 with Soviet admirals concerning the K-129. Huchthausen states that Admiral Novoytsev told him, "Captain, you are very young and inexperienced, but you will learn that in some matters both nations have agreed not to discuss. One of them is the reasons we lost the K-129. Later in 1995, Huchthausen began work on his book on the Soviet underwater fleet. He interviewed Admiral Victor Degalo, who stated that the true history of the K-129 has not been revealed because of an informal agreement between the two countries' senior naval commands. The purpose of that secrecy, he alleged, is to stop any further research into the losses of the USS Scorpion and the K-129. Huchthausen states that Degalo told him to overlook this matter and hope that the time will come when the truth will be told to the families of the victims. Interestingly, Admiral Degalo appears in the Project Azorian video. In the Azorian video, he states that the K-29 was sunk after a collision with the USS Swordfish. I have an audio recording that I've taken from the Azorian video. He's speaking in Russian in the background with a translator in the foreground. The audio is a little scratchy, but until you get your copy of the Azorian to listen to it, I'm going to play that for you now.
Yeah, Steve, the audio is not coming through. That's better.
It's a very ratty recording, unfortunately. There's nothing much I can do about that one. But this is a picture that's also provided on the Azorian video, and you can see Swordfish written in the Cyrillic alphabet at the bottom, K-129, indicative of an indication of a hit. In response to the Admiral's comment near the end of the Azorian video, there's a disclaimer discussion of the U.S. providing the Soviets with the actual USS Swordfish handwritten daily operating logs, which they did in 1992, showing it was nowhere near the K-129. I researched the U.S. Naval Archives, where copies of all U.S. Navy ship deck logs are kept. Interestingly, there is no copy of this purported operating log in the Naval History Archives. The video also shows a picture with the Swordfish's periscope damage, and it shows the back of the sail and say it shows no damage, but it does not show the front of the sail. So was it possible that the Soviet Union was conducting a payback scheme on the US? As of today, the US has still not publicly acknowledged such an act. However, all of the facts I have provided support this theory. Remember that the same people who kept assuring families and relatives that the Scorpion would arrive in Norfolk very soon, even after they knew the ship was lost at sea. Nothing can change the loss of the Scorpion and the hardships of the families left behind, but the world of espionage continues today. May our future losses be data and not lie. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Steve, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. But if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. But here's one from Steve Martin. And he asks, is there any chance this torpedo, essentially a drone, that could cloak itself to radar as a whale or other biological signal, follow a submarine and then strike on the sub on command? That's what my mother suggested to me in our living room in 1968. She had come back from a meeting in 1968 at Fort Meade.
Well, I don't know the details in that time of what the Soviet had in long-range remotely operated vehicles. I don't think they had any, but the real key, and I tried to make that point, I may have missed it, is since the Swordfish is giving its position every day, the Russians know exactly where the ship is. It would have been very easy for a helicopter to go to that position and drop a torpedo. It would be very close to where the ship actually was. That's what I interpret would have happened.
Rich, do you have some written ones, or I have?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Jack.
I have a couple of comments. The
Yes,
Azorian video was just fascinating to me. The engineering feat was incredible.
Well, I went into it a long time for that reason. It's just mind-boggling, and you can watch it if you have Amazons.
Yeah, it's worth watching, and I'm not usually into engineering, but they interview the guys that designed it and built it, and it's just fascinating. What a feat. I read, I think it's called HistoryNet, and they suggested there at the end that Scorpion had reported in that it was being trailed by a Soviet submarine, and couldn't lose them. And I don't remember, they quoted an admiral, and I don't remember who it was, and so on. But have you heard anything to that effect, that sort of detail?
Yes, I have. And there is, in fact, another book written, like the one that I showed you, All Hands Down. But there's another one written that basically says what happened is when she went to look at the Soviet, everything in the beginning is the same. It's just that when she went to look at it, instead of a helicopter, they had a submarine that pulled in behind her and followed her and actually sunk her. That's another possibility. It doesn't, for the majority of my story remains unchanged with that final outcome. It's just the torpedo came from a different source. And again, since they know exactly where the ship is, hiding doesn't work.
Sure, yeah. And for those who weren't submariners, it's impossible to hear what's behind you because of the noise from the screws. And so they were reporting, as I understood it, that they were unable to lose that submarine. And I don't know what they were trying to do to lose it, but yeah.
Yeah, I have that in my folder somewhere, the name of that book too, but I'm sure if you just search Loss of the Scorpion, that one will come up as another option.
Yeah.
Hey, Steve, I have a question a little bit off of the program. I had a good friend of mine who was a submariner, and later in life, after he retired, he had serious cancer and actually passed away from it. What is the sense of the threat of serving on these nuclear subs and eventually having cancer problems?
I will say as unequivocally as I can that we were always very well protected. We always had a badge on that was recording any radiation. And we had an occasion when I was doing some maintenance in Spain at the port there in Rota, and one of our guys, one of the engineering guys, left his badge. He had to put a coat on over top for the work he was doing. When he took it off, he left his badge there and came back down to the ship. We had to get underway. So we got him another badge, obviously. And that badge was laying in the warehouse on a pier in Rota, Spain for 30 days. We measured them once a month. So it was about the same time as the one he would have measured. And when we came back, that badge was completely, totally off the chart. It was not even close to anything. And it was just setting out in the sun. So
Wow.
You're in much more danger if you live in Denver, Colorado, than if you're on a submarine.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
let's see, Steve Martin again, he says he's never shared that story with anyone. Who would believe it? But now it seems clearly possible.
Well, like I said, I didn't tell you this, but when I was at the Naval Academy, we went out to sea on ships, obviously in the summer. And in 1968, there were people in my company that were supposed to go on the Scorpion, and they were waiting for it to come back. And of course, it never showed up in Norfolk. And we had a lot of in college room discussions about what could have happened. And the subsafe excuse never made sense to me. The hot run torpedo made sense until they showed the picture of it on the bottom, which we saw, and that didn't make sense. So regardless of what happened, I think there's enough, for want of a better word, obfuscation of the whole situation to warrant further discussion.
Yeah, the lengthy theories about that hot run torpedo. I read a book called Blind Man's Bluff about U.S. Soviet espionage, and it focused almost entirely on the hot run torpedo thing, and it just didn't make sense to me.
Blind Man's Bluff is one of my favorite books because there's a story in there that I knew because I knew the CO that I can now talk about because it's in the book. But no, you're right. Everything about it doesn't make sense. But the real key, when people start, and even in the Azorian video, when they're trying to talk down the proof, quote unquote, the links, nobody mentions John Anthony Walker.
Yeah.
And that's the real key, because he's giving all the information to them the whole time this is going on.
Yeah.
That's the real key.
Your original talk that I saw really scared me, I guess. We were up off Murmansk, the North Sea Soviet base, for that spring of '68, and they may have known everything we were doing while we were there.
Oh, yeah. Reading your communications, all of them.
Yeah. Steve, a fascinating talk. Just one comment I have is that, the fact that the Soviets could read all of our naval communications is analogous to what happened during World War II, where the Allies could basically read all of the German naval communications because we had the ability to break the Enigma machines. And
and if you
the
think
mechanisms were different, but the fact that we knew a lot about where the German subs were during World War II was devastating. I mean, to them.
Well, and if you think back to if you've had a chance to look at some of the videos on Alan Turing, and you note the fact that they knew a U.S. fleet was about to be attacked, and they couldn't say anything because if they did, they would release that they knew the data.
Yeah. No, it's a definite conundrum. When you have intelligence, you have to really weigh the cost of using it. And so,
there was a note that someone would like to unblock his video or his audio and talk. Yeah,
I guess that's from Steve Martin. I'm not sure. I think that went away. There was another. It just Steve is. Here's one from Fred Stastowski. He said, "Is the ASROC still used today on board our ASW warships?"
I honestly don't know. I haven't been on one of our warships for several years. Remember, I converted, in about 1983 to working in both at the embassy and at in submarine ops in Naples, Italy. I spent less and less time on those ships, so I don't have any current background on those.
Listen, I know I really appreciate this because that story, seriously, I haven't shared that story with anybody I can recall since 1968. My mother used to work for what was ostensibly something downtown in DC called the Electronics Industry Association, and from time to time was from time to time was called out to Fort Meade, Maryland, for day-long meetings. So she related that with that theory. I didn't mean to make it say she was saying this as we know this happened and the Russians did it. She was just saying, what if I told you, kind of positing, I guess just to get the weight of this thing off her chest, I don't know, if such a thing is possible. Well, the bombshell you dropped was that given that Walker had enabled the Russians to monitor all of our top secret communications in the Navy for what, 14 years or something? Was that right?
18 years.
18 years. My God, that's devastating. That's unbelievable. So, yeah, your theory, just imagine they dispatch a helicopter or a small Corsair or any vessel once they know the location and dispense a submarine that, I would suggest, can cloak itself, okay?
Yes,
to
sir.
come off as, to give off a radar signal suggesting that it is in fact a whale, or maybe it reappears as a series of dolphins. I'm not a Navy guy, but if we had the wherewithal to lift a submarine 3 miles down, don't you think the Russians could have devised an attack vehicle capable of masking itself close enough to get to the Thresher, or to the that's another one, the Thresher. But anyway,
The Scorpion.
K-1,
Well, what's funny about it is they checked it and said it's not possible and left.
Well, I can't. I have to go, guys. But thank you so much for this. This is like unbelievable. I really appreciate this talk, and thank you for letting me have a little lip time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Just one final comment from Fred Satowski. He said he was, I don't remember the name of the ship he was on, but he was out waiting for orders, I guess, to go when the Pueblo was captured. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Steve, for a really fascinating talk. Just let everybody know we are recording this, and after we get it edited, we'll post it on our website and on YouTube so you can watch it again. There's a lot of fascinating things here.